There's no greater transition in life than when you go from that accumulation phase where you're working and you're saving dollars and preparing for a period of time when you're not going to work. And then you transition and you effectively go from the accumulation phase to this distribution phase. And along the way, though, given how significant of a shift that is, there's certainly a variety of potholes that can pop up that can really serve to undermine the quality of that transition. So in this segment of the program, we wanted to take some time and sort of talk through some of the bigger ones, some of the more important ones that you need to really focus on if you are approaching this type of transition when you are leaving sort of the workforce and shifting on in to retirement. As you might expect, the conversation really does start with getting a handle on your expenses. Now, the funny thing here is many people have never really done a budget while they're working, but when you make this transition, you probably want to sit down and at least sketch up some kind of a cash flow perspective for what those expenses are going to look like in retirement, because a lot of people really kind of fail to give that a proper perspective. The reality is that things like health insurance, taxes, free time expenses, we've certainly talked about those categories on prior episodes of the program. Those are big numbers, okay? If you're trying to retire before the age of 65, for a married couple in their early 60s, health insurance can often be $1,500 to $2,000 a month. After 65, which is when you become eligible for Medicare, there's still a cost if you go the traditional way of Part A, Part B, and get a supplement, and then Part D for the drugs. That's still going to be about $800 or so for a couple. So those are significant sort of line item numbers that you probably haven't been having as a line item expense during the period of time while you've been working, because for the most part, a lot of employers will take care of that, or certainly take care of a pretty good chunk of that as well. And then by virtue of you being part of a group plan, right, then the costs spread among a larger number of people, bringing those costs down. When you shift to retirement, it's just you. There's no group retirement healthcare plan. That's called Medicare, and that one doesn't kick in until 65. So understand the impact that health insurance is going to have in terms of your overall expenses. And then, of course, you got to remember the taxes, right? When you're working, I think everybody's used to seeing the net number. That's the number that goes into my checking account. I don't worry about it beyond that. But the reality is that in retirement, you need to account for those taxes as part of your income. We're going to have some more thoughts on that piece here later on in this conversation. But and then, of course, lastly is the free time expense, right? That's the reality is that's probably going to be higher during the first part of your retirement, because when you retire, you'll be the youngest age that you will be in retirement, right? Every day we get older, that's the reality. Here we are, it's already February. I don't quite know where the first month of the 2025 year went, but the reality is that when you do retire, you're more likely to use it as an opportunity to do things that you maybe haven't had the opportunity to do because you're working. And oftentimes those things require money. So what we typically see is when somebody first retires, there's a greater need for income. There's a greater need for resources and money because they're doing more. So that's an important thing to kind of put into the mix. I think far too often people kind of think of those expenses of travel and whatnot as sort of a constant expense. The reality is what we see is that those are much higher, at least early on in those first few years of retirement. So make sure you really kind of have properly accounted for that. That's why the notion of creating at least some form of a budget as you're starting to make that transition into retirement really helps to bring perspective into some of these numbers that you don't necessarily see while you are still working. And then, of course, don't forget about inflation, right? That's always there. Typically runs 2-3% per year. Over a 10-year period of time, if inflation is running at 2 or 3%, you probably need 30%, maybe even 40% more money in to effectively have the same purchasing power, given that the impact of inflation, just like anything else, is compounded, right? If inflation is 5% one year and then 5% the next year, well, then your inflation effectively over those first couple of years is going to be north of 10%, not the 5%. So remember that compounding impact of inflation is pretty important, just as it is equally important in terms of your investment results over time. The same thing is happening on the inflation side as well. And then, of course, having the right investment mix makes this list of potholes to avoid on the transition to retirement. That always makes the list of anything. We were talking about that earlier in the program about you certainly want to have a good handle on your investment allocation, particularly in light of some of these headlines that came out of China just this past week involving DeepSeek and some of the AI changes or models that they have been able to produce, which certainly adversely impacted particularly that sector of the overall market. So you want to make sure you have balance when it comes to your investments. You want to make sure that you're diversified, certainly have some parts that are conservative, some parts that are more growth oriented, but try not to go too far on that. I think that's an issue that we see where more and more folks will push more and more of their allocation of their investments into the more conservative side of things. And while it's certainly good to have a portion of any portfolio that has that more conservative side, you've got to think about life expectancies. You've got to think about inflation. The reality is you could very well end up in retirement for 3, maybe even 4 decades. And certainly, your retirement time period could certainly be as long as the amount of time that you spent working and accumulating those assets. So you have to have some positions or some allocation that is designed for growth over time, particularly to keep track of longevity, to keep up with longevity and inflation. So, in terms of what that number is, I mean, obviously that is unique to the individual. We like to think of it in terms of income and how much income am I drawing out of a portfolio? Well, kind of the normal rates of income that you should be drawing out of a portfolio should be around 4 or 5%. And so if you think about it in terms of years, right? So how long might I have to go and sort of really relying or leaning heavily on the conservative side of the portfolio because there's some headline or market decline or whatever, so how long is that? Is that 4 years? Is that 5 years, 6